Let me start off by welcoming everyone to, I believe this is the third episode of what is the Pushing for Change podcast. And I am the aptly named KB, the one and only KB, as Josh would call me, among many other nicknames that I won't get into here. And wonderful guest, Laura Coulter, is it? Is it? Because I always want to pronounce it French, but it's Coulter.
So it's actually, it goes back to Scottish roots, so it's Coulter.
Okay. For whatever reason, I've always wanted to pronounce it Colte, and I know that that's not right, but just there's an impulse in me that just wants to make it French.
I tell you what, I appreciate that, you tried to pronounce it properly, but if you want to give it a French twist, I'm not going to argue.
Well, I appreciate that, but I will respect those that provided the name and pronounce it correctly. But again, just wanted to welcome everyone that chooses to listen to this, to the next episode, and we'll be getting into some interesting topics, I think, tonight. I think you and I have had quite a list of topics to kind of mull through and kind of pick and choose, but I think given that we are coming up on some primary elections within the next few weeks or so, there's been a lot of disability-related election news, and I'll let you kind of start that off with some things that I know you kind of brought to my attention.
Well, thank you for that. So voting is really important to me. The elections are really important to me because, this is probably the biggest time every year that the average American like ourselves gets to use our voice, right? Our votes are our voices are our power. And so voting is really important to me. I have made such an effort from where I used to be as a kid, not a kid, but, a young adult, not really caring about voting in the primaries, not really caring about voting if it wasn't a presidential election. And now every election I'm at the polls, I'm encouraging other people to vote. And I recently stumbled across this video on social media. It was a lady talking to one of the gubernatorial candidates in a pretty divisive state. And this lady was talking about how voting is such a struggle for her because she has some disabilities that make it very hard to submit a paper ballot. And this was really eye-opening to me because, I understand the struggles of voting in person, whether you work 12-hour shifts or 24-hour shifts, depending on if you're in some emergency services, or if you don't have transportation, you can't get to the polls. So I understand the idea of not being able to go vote in person, but this was really a new perspective for me because this lady was talking about how she struggles with. So first, she can't go vote in person because of her disabilities, making it difficult to travel to drive places. And additionally, it's challenging for her to fill out a paper ballot because when you fill out a paper ballot, your signature gets scrutinized against your saved signature on your voter registration gets scrutinized against the signature on the ballot. And as a result, this lady's mail-in ballot was rejected, and she wasn't even notified of that until about 6 months after the election had taken place. So her voice had no power. She had no voice, and she didn't even know that until 6 months after the election. And so this was a whole new perspective for me, and it breaks my heart and it infuriates me because that's supposed to be one of the number one features of being in a democracy like we are, is that we vote for what we care about. And so finding out that there's this whole new layer of challenges to voting for people with disabilities was really eye-opening for me.
Me as well, especially because we talked a little bit about this, prior to tonight, but I don't have the same signature twice. I have never since I've learned cursive, I have never signed my name the same way twice. So I don't understand how that like my brain cannot compute so much of that. Like, how does that happen? Because for someone who doesn't have the same, handwriting twice, I've never had an issue where my vote wasn't counted. But to go further with that, like, how does someone go 6 months without informing the person that there was an issue with the signature? Like, I when you talk about like voting fraud and things like that, I'm like, wait a minute. These are the things that are really something that needs to be addressed. And is that I didn't even know that was a thing that was happening.
Right. Well, I mean, going back to the signatures, same problem. My signature never looks the same. It's just kind of, it especially depends. Like just this morning, I had to sign for coffee at work for the delivery, and it was one of those electronic signatures. I don't even try on those things anymore. I just scribble some, ups and downs and cross a T and hope it looks good.
Right.
It's so like hearing that and that's fine. I've never been in an instance where somebody goes, I'm sorry, that doesn't look like your signature. Can you do it again? And so hearing that this lady's signature wasn't good enough the time that it matters the most, but, I can scribble something anytime I want, and that's my binding signature, is just, it's infuriating, because that was this lady's vote. And how many other people in this country are having their votes suppressed because somebody's choosing to scrutinize a signature when we should be using that energy to make things more accessible, to make it easier for people's voices to be heard.
And to go even further with that, how many votes are not being counted, and people aren't being informed that they're not being counted? Like, okay, this is one case of where a voter was notified 6 months after the fact, but how we don't even know how frequent situations like this possibly are.
Exactly. And additionally, there's the issue that, you have to be registered to vote. And that, even though, you're an American citizen, and therefore you have the right to vote, you have the right to cast a vote that's speaking your voice, that is your power in this country, you still have to register first. And for people who maybe don't have easily accessible methods to register, that's a huge problem too. In my line of activism that I've been in, we give out voter registration forms to people. And one thing that we've started doing since I joined is adding stamps to those. So they're already stamped. So it's not one more thing a person has to do just to fill out their voter registration form. We say, here's the form, you can fill it out here. Here's the nearest mailbox to drop it off in, because we want to make things as accessible as possible. And this is kind of branching away from physical accessibility, but even just the cost of a stamp. Maybe some people don't, they're not going to spend, what is it now, like $10 to buy a book of stamps? I don't even know. I try not to mail things.
Yeah, I try not to go to the post. Yesterday was the first time I was actually at the UPS store. And that was the first time I've been in any sort of mail facility, office facility, in probably a good 5-10 years. So yeah, I don't know what the cost of a stamp would be. So if you say it's $10, I have no reason to believe it's not.
I really don't know. I haven't bought stamps in a while, but I did just recently read the prices going up again. So if you're unable to get to the post office or a grocery store that sells stamps, or you don't have the extra money for a book of stamps, I think the post office will sell you just an an individual stamp, but I don't know about grocery stores. So if your post office is not accessible, if your post office, and I realize I believe post offices especially are supposed to be accessible, but I know even the post office that I frequent,
Mhm.
it has double doors, and one set of doors is automatic, and the other set of doors you have to push open
Right.
or pull. So like, is that really accessible? Like, to me that doesn't seem like it, because if I'm in a wheelchair or something, that's that much more complicated. So am I going to make that extra effort to go to the post office to get a single stamp
Hmm.
so I can mail in my voter registration?
Right. And I mean, to your point, and I'd have to do a little bit more research on this, but under the ADA, you only really need, I say you collectively, but businesses only really need to have one entrance to be considered ADA, or an accessible door. So you can have three different entrances. Doesn't mean you need three handicap accessible entrances. Only one of them really need to be accessible under the law that was written 32 years ago. So
So what if it's the case of like double doors though? So, the first set of doors, it's automatic, but then
mhm.
you're just stuck in between two sets of doors. What about that second set of doors? Does that have
that
to be?
that really brings up an interesting question, because I haven't run into that situation myself, so I don't know what I would imagine that if the first set of doors to get into a building are accessible, then the other set of doors to lead you further into the entrance should also be should be accessible in some way.
One would hope.
I would hope, but um, no, you and I know that government buildings don't always handle accessibility in a timely or logical fashion.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'd have to do some more research about that, and maybe we can, after doing so, we can dive into that and see what see what the law says about that, because that seems kind of counterproductive to only have one set of doors to a to a to an entrance be accessible, and kind of leaving you in building purgatory.
Right. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, so
Um,
I don't know. That is an interesting point, but also to that, like, I'm just thinking, going back to the signature portion of the issue. Depending upon what your disability is, you may not have the mobility in your arms or your hands. So would somebody be allowed to sign your name for you, or is that considered forging a signature? Like, so like that's where I think having like some sort of stamped signature would
yes.
really be of benefit. I mean, and there's enough places online now where you can go and you can order your own personalized signature stamp.
Right.
And I think that would really, help alleviate some of these issues, but at the same time, might be opening an even more of a Pandora's box, because uh, who's to say that that's the actual signature that person owns? Like, it
Right.
just, there's so much murkiness to this whole issue that, in an attempt to solve one problem, you might be opening yourself up to other problems.
Agreed. But if we wanted to follow the path of whataboutism, right? Like,
Right.
then technically, because at least in Pennsylvania, they don't even check IDs, at least not
Mhm.
in my county. Um, so I don't think I've ever had to show my ID in Pennsylvania to vote. Maybe the first time when I first voted after moving here. But who's to say I couldn't just walk in and say that I'm my neighbor who passed away last year,
Mm.
and give a decent attempt at her signature,
Mhm.
and cast a vote for her, and then come back later in the day with my hair looking different and say I'm me. Like, I mean,
Right.
yeah, there's absolutely opportunities for fraud with a stamped signature, but there's already opportunities for fraud. um And, if we're thinking about stamped signatures, maybe something like being able to cast a ballot online.
Yeah, I don't know why that hasn't been a greater there hasn't been a greater push for that, because we're in I still consider us in the pandemic era. Like, I don't know where we are as far as the pandemic, and if there's an increase of, like, I don't know where we are as far as cases and things like that. But from where we started and how things were closed, and how schools were going online teaching, like, yes, we should absolutely be making things more accessible from a digital standpoint, or an online standpoint, so that, yeah, for people that can't get paratransit to their local post office at the time that they need to be there to cast their vote, absolutely, we should all have the option to vote online.
I agree. And we should be, I think, automatically registered to vote. If I'm an American citizen, I should be registered to vote, and of voting age. And
Yes.
obviously not having any sort of, I don't know, criminal convictions that could make me ineligible to vote. But, like, why do I have to take an extra step just to be able to register, just to prove that I'm allowed to vote, right?
Hmm.
Before I can even go vote. Like, all we're doing is adding more complexity to the voting process, which for me, as somebody who is, physically able, without a physical disability, and I can typically, like, leave on my lunch break, or I have a pretty flexible schedule, so I can make sure I can go cast my vote. I have my own car. So for me, it's okay. It's an extra step, registering to vote that one time, and then um, going to go vote in person. It's a hassle, but it's fine. But for somebody with a physical disability, for somebody who can't sign their name well, there's just, it starts piling up. And it seems like such a way to make sure that people with disabilities are continued to be seen as kind of less than a whole human,
Right.
perhaps, because your vote doesn't always count. You might be stuck in door purgatory at the post office, and no one does anything to change it, because the bare minimum of one set of accessible doors has been met.
Right. And that's where we are from a societal standpoint. Is, well, the bare minimum is enough. It's good enough when we could be doing more. And uh, it brings to mind a situation. Um, I found myself bringing Josh into conversation way more than I ever anticipated. But if you'll humor me,
Of
uh,
course.
you know, November, it's roughly turning fall and into winter. Weather's getting colder. The likelihood for inclement, icy, snowy weather increases. So I'm just thinking, again, from an accessibility standpoint, there was a situation where, when Josh was living in Philadelphia, I was visiting, over a weekend or whatever the case was, and it was snowing. So I was like, all right, well, I'm not driving home in the snow, so I'm just going to crash here for the weekend. Well, the snow plows plowed all the snow up against his door to the house, to his
Mm-hmm.
apartment, so he couldn't get out.
Mm-hmm.
So not only do you have the potential of paratransit not working, but then you also have your city workers creating, you know rather unintentionally, even more of a difficult process for you to get out, because of things like plowing the snow up against the handicap parking spots, or
Mm-hmm.
the curb cuts, or just creating more difficult situations for you to try and navigate.
Right. And two, if you've got to take public transportation, you've got to wait for the right bus. If that bus is running late, you just worked super hard to get out to the bus stop and wait there cold for who knows how long because the bus is late, and it's not worth it for you to struggle, or you meaning, any person with a
Hmm.
disability, especially, to
Hmm.
struggle back to your house to, wait for the bus to get back on its route. Um, it's interesting to think about how, especially, weather creates even more of an obstacle for people with disabilities. And voting is already a bad time of the year. Like, I understand why it's in November, but I mean, in my area in November, we could have a couple feet of snow by then.
Right, exactly. If you're not having 6 feet of snow by November, there's something oddly wrong in your neck of the woods. But yeah, and again, even with the paratransit, and I've experienced this, with Josh too. You know, yes, I mean, you might be waiting for a bus, but you also, I mean, we've also had instances where, yeah, the bus will just drive past because they see that, you're in a wheelchair and they may not want to go through the process of, you know, unloading the ramp and putting the chair and buckling the chair into the section of the bus that's, now has to be, you know, where the seats have to move, and then you have to, you know, adjust the seating arrangement so that you could fit a chair. I've seen it where, buses will take a look at what the situation is for who's waiting, and if there's people in a chair, they will at times just drive by because it's easier to say, you know what, I'm not dealing with that today. And that's a terrible, terrible thing, um, to be at the mercy of others. Like, you're already in a vulnerable position because you have, physical limitations,
Mhm.
and now you're relying upon others to help get you to where you need to be. And it's so, I mean, I take for granted because I have a little bit more mobility, but, seeing it from the other side and seeing what some of those challenges are, it is so frustrating that even today, even in 2022, we still are not making things, um, reasonably accessible so that every, people say, oh, every life matters. Well, disabled lives matter too. And
Right.
until, you want to say, oh, Black Lives Matter, every life, well, until disabled lives matter, yeah, we can fight that issue too.
Right. Well, and so 2 points to that. One, that goes back to what we were messaging about earlier today, that, so many groups of minorities have been made to appear less than.
Hmm.
And, we collectively, as all the minorities, whether you're a person of color, whether you're a person with disabilities, whether you're a person with a uterus, whether you're a person who is on the LGBTQ spectrum, like, wherever you fall, like, that's where we all have to band together, because there's such a pervasive view that every other group is less than.
Right.
And then my other point is really just, it's so infuriating to think of a bus driver not doing their job and driving by a person, in a wheelchair, potentially because it's too much work to help them get on the bus. And it makes me think about how in our society, in this country, we're all about independence, right? And that's not just like, as a country, independence, but like this personal independence. Like, we have to have cars, we have to drive to work, we have to um leave our parents home when we're very young adults, sometimes still teenagers, honestly, because we have been ingrained in this way of thinking that independence is freedom, instead of um, kind of this societal interdependence where, hey, it's okay to expect somebody to help you a little bit, or to ask for help. And a bus driver should absolutely do their job and help somebody who is in a wheelchair to get on the bus, because that is their job. And it's not a sign of weakness to need a little more help, but we're such a society of thinking that we have to be independent. And if you're not independent, if you're not as independent as I am, then you're less of a human being.
Absolutely. And I don't know how to make that change. I mean, you are among the two of us, here tonight, more of the proactive activist, where I'm kind of in a situation like I don't even know where to begin to make that change of how do you get someone, how do you change someone's mindset to be like, oh yeah, you matter.
That's a tough one. Yeah, I think a lot of it is going to start with the younger generations.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think that our generation is just like the almost like the neutral place of where we're just trying to shield the younger generations from some of the BS that we've been seeing. While we know that we ourselves can't make as much of a change, but hopefully we can support the next couple generations to doing that. But that's still not, that doesn't help right now.
Right. And you have so much, at least I think, so much of the older generations trying to hold on to their maybe outdated beliefs.
Definitely.
Where it's like, okay, can the boomers just kind of sit in the corner for a little while and let us do what we need to do?
I know. And that goes back to this idealism of the good old days, right? The 1950s were the good old days if you were a fully able white male.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what I've always been taught, even as a woman who wouldn't have even been able to vote back in the 50s, I've been taught that, those were the good old days. That's when everything was good. And when you start looking at the actual history, then you realize like people were oppressed, women weren't able to vote, people of color couldn't vote, people with disabilities were even worse off than they are now. But that's not to say that we've done enough.
Right, of course.
But that's how that older generation is really holding on to their power. And I think about it too, a lot of the people in power who are older, if they have a physical disability, they have a lot of money.
Right.
So their physical disability is less of a hindrance. I think you and I were talking, I had a conversation with somebody recently about a certain governor who I didn't realize was in a wheelchair. But, this person has enough money that, so many obstacles can be paid to get rid of,
Sure.
or paid to make much less of an obstacle, I should say. I'm not trying to knock anybody who's in a wheelchair ever. No. But there's a huge difference between somebody who's got millions of dollars and is in a wheelchair and somebody who has $4 and is in a wheelchair. And so that's just another way that kind of perpetuates this idea that the people struggling with disabilities, the people who don't have money, the people who don't have power, the people who don't have help or can't afford help, those people are less than. While, this government or governor who's in a wheelchair, maybe, he should be the norm. He's the one we prop up as an independent person with disabilities.
Right. And because they're in a position of power, so to speak, they, if they so chose, could make living with a disability a lot easier for people. Like you said, there's the haves and there's the have-nots, and most people that are living with a disability are not living beyond their means because it was a car accident that was a drunk driver's fault, and they got a multi-million-dollar settlement, and now they're well taken care of. Like that's not the everyday disabled person's experience. So for a politician or just someone who has the capability financially to make it easier for others in a similar situation. I mean, I don't know. I'd like to think if it were me, then I would not be, hogging all of the money for myself and trying to make, society at large easier for everybody. It's why I get so annoyed when I see, Jeff Bezos or, Elon Musk sending somebody to space. I'm like, okay, so you just spent, $45 million to send William Shatner to, the edge of the edge of you know
The
Earth.
atmosphere, yeah.
Could you not have done something else? Like what did that truly accomplish in the grand scheme of things, other than be a joyride for someone?
It got them attention. That's all they
Yeah.
want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think, those people who wind up in government who do have those disabilities or are minorities, and there are some exceptions, so I don't want to say this is always black and white, but, they end up being so corrupted by the power, they end up being so corrupted by the money. They're there for themselves. They're not there for other people. And watching this election, and the candidates in various states, whether it's, gubernatorial or Senate or Congress, it's been so eye-opening to me, how different a lot of these candidates are. Like the video I was referencing before, where the lady was talking about how her ballot was rejected because of her signature. The candidate who was listening to her like stopped and focused in and talked to her. He listened to her and asked, like, how did she feel when she found out that her ballot was rejected? Just that personal connection. You can see the difference there. When there's that person, and even though this person, to my knowledge, doesn't have any physical disabilities, he still cared, and he's
Right.
one of those people who hasn't been corrupted by that power. Versus, we see some people in politics right now who are people with disabilities, but they don't care. And I think we're just lacking total empathy in our political side in this country. And I'm hopeful that this election cycle is going to change that, but we need a lot more change. We have a lot of areas we can do better in.
We do, and I mean, prior to 2020, I think if those 4 years didn't show you that, we should not be such a hostile. I don't know what the right word would be, but we shouldn't be treating people with differences as the enemy, so to speak. Like I know there's another, again, staying with politics, a politician whose name escapes me, but suffered a stroke, and the candidate that they're going up against is using that stroke as a means of attack of well, is this person really capable of being a leader if they can't even communicate properly, and it's just using politics are such a gross form of show. I mean, it's not even like you get to choose, who's the best. It's like, who's best of the worst.
Right. Who's the least bad.
Yeah.
And I think 2020, in my opinion, 2020 really showed us that. I know a lot of people in my circle, for sure, were more so voting against a candidate than voting for a candidate. And it's funny because you're bringing up, the stroke. That's my candidate. That's in PA, and I've seen those ads as well, and it's just infuriating to me that a person who suffered a stroke, and my grandfather died from a stroke, so we know that they're absolutely capable of being fatal.
Right.
And so this person suffered a stroke back in Christ, January. It was pretty recent. And then just a few months later, he was already on the road campaigning
Mhm.
because he cares about this. And so to watch another candidate attacking him because he's still recovering and he's going through, I can't even imagine the amount of stress there is in, traveling all around the state and having to stay in various hotels and meet and greets with all these people and speaking events, when you're still trying to get through not just the physical trauma, but the mental and emotional trauma, of having a stroke. Like that's huge. But it's being weaponized against him, versus, another candidate who is wealthy and, has always had kind of a smooth, personality on TV. So he's just trying to hit at weaknesses that shouldn't even be considered weaknesses. I don't mind if it takes you a little longer to speak or find the right words or if you have a stutter, but I do care if you have empathy.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back. I don't remember what year this happened, but I believe it was an Arizona governor, Gabby Giffords, when she was shot in the head, and
Mhm.
you know had to learn how to
10 years ago.
yeah, had to learn how to talk again. And
Hmm.
I don't remember it, and I'm not to say that it didn't happen, but I don't remember there being such a volatile response of like, oh, is she capable of like the world seemed to surround her in love and light and
Hmm.
support. Meanwhile, not that a stroke is the same as a gunshot wound, but it's still a horrible event that
Yeah.
happened to someone, and to use that as fodder for like their capabilities to
Mhm.
it's just so gross. And I pray, and I'm not a real huge praying individual, but I do pray that we get away from this reality TV is good enough to get into politics
Agreed.
type, type thing. I it's you know I,
Agreed. Um,
keep the politics in to the people that spent time and studied politics. I mean,
mhm.
it's such a gross where we are to where we started. I don't know how we got here, but we need to get away from here as quickly as possible.
Agreed. Um, Going back to your point about, the lack of attacks against, the politician in Arizona, I do question if a lot of that was because, gun violence is such a hot topic. And so, attacking somebody because they're suffering after being a victim of gun violence, well, we just saw what happened to that one guy who was fined almost $1 billion.
Yeah.
Which in my opinion wasn't nearly enough. But that's where I wonder if the difference was. But ultimately, I think that this norm we have now of just attacking the other candidates is so it sheds so much light on really where we are as a society. Instead of being tactful, instead of just saying like, "Hey, here's what I believe, and here's what I'm going to do if you elect me to be in this political position." Instead, we're just dragging another person down. And I have a 9-year old, and we
Right.
just had the conversation today. One of her very best friends is speaking, derogatorily because of a difference between Hannah and this friend, and
Hmm.
talking about and basically making Hannah feel bad
Hmm.
about it. And we have to have those conversations of that. This friend is just feeling kind of insecure, and her way of making herself feel better, unfortunately, is to drag other people down.
Right.
And it starts so young. So how to make that better? I don't know yet because like I'm already seeing it, in the youngest generation we have. But we've got to start somewhere because this whole belittling people, especially because of things they can't change, things that have happened to them, things that are simply how they are and should be celebrated and appreciated instead of uh, devaluing to them. It's got to stop. And I don't know how we even start that, but it's not healthy.
No, it's not, and I mean it's such a shame that kids are going through that. You'd think that you would have hoped that by the time we became adults that bullying would have stopped being a thing, but you know I mean, that to me that's perpetuated by the parents or lack of parenting, or you know just modeling what they see. And I mean, outside of you going to that individual's home and like confronting the parent, like I don't know of a less confrontational solution to, like, stop having your kid be an asshole.
Right. But a lot of times, even too, if you try to bring up things like that, like, hey, your kid's not being appropriate, other parents will get defensive.
Yeah,
So it's,
I mean this in no slight, but I'm so glad I don't have kids.
I completely understand the sentiment in terms of, yeah, it's challenging. It's really challenging to try to raise an empath when we live in a society that has no empathy for differences, that has no empathy for other minority groups or minority groups in general, that has no empathy for people with disabilities, especially. It's very hard to swim against that norm, kind of, and say like, hey, I know these kids are being assholes, but that's not you, and
Hmm.
here's why that matters. It's tough. But that's where I think talks like this and the more attention we can bring to these issues, that's the first thing we can do.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so glad that, I mean, it really means more than I can emphasize, that you're willing and interested to kind of take up this mantle with me, to kind of continue this conversation. Because yeah, I mean, that's the first line of defense, is being able to sit down with people of different backgrounds and philosophies and say, all right, well, how do you feel about this situation? And all right, well, how do you feel? And
Right.
finding some sort of common ground. We don't have to agree on everything, and I wouldn't want to agree on everything, but it doesn't have to be, oh, well, you believe in this, so I hate you.
Right. Well, and first, I really appreciate that, you, and, starting with Josh, like, you guys have helped me so much understand these perspectives that I never understood, that I never had any experience with before. Because that is part of it too. I think a lot of times there are people who want to do better and would do better if they had somebody to kind of help guide us through that, for
Right.
lack of a better term, because it's like, okay, we talked last time about how like there's just this divide, and you don't want to say anything and be offensive, you don't want to say the wrong thing ever, and so we don't say anything. But
Right.
what somebody like me should absolutely be doing is using my voice to or using my platform to elevate your voice, or having those conversations that help me understand better, so that I can continue to use my voice to advocate. But that's just something that seems to be much more rare than
Right.
it should be.
And I mean, this is just like an inside discussion for you and me. I know nobody listening to this will understand what you and I are talking about, but that was why I was so adamant about the issue that I was having personally,
Mhm.
as far as accessibility issues go in my place of working,
Mhm.
because it felt like no. I can only say that it felt like nobody was really understanding why that issue was as important to me as it was.
Right.
And that's where having someone such as yourself and people like Josh, like, they get it. Like, they may not have the answer to the solution, but they can understand it and appreciate where you are coming from, as
Mhm.
to why something is as important to you. I mean, it may not be that important to them, but they respect that it's important to you, and
Right.
therefore they're going to do whatever they can do to speed up that process, to fix whatever's wrong, or to right whatever's wrong, and not have that just kind of fall by the wayside.
And that's something, I think is so much more rare, is just that solidarity of like, hey, this is a concern for you, and even though it doesn't affect me, I see how it affects you, and it makes me angry that there's not a better solution in place. And if there is something I can do, absolutely I will, because you matter as a person. You matter just as much as I do, whether there is an issue at your workplace that needs to be resolved or not.
Mm-hmm. And that was really something that I kind of, I don't want to say come to terms with, but just acknowledging that, hey, I deserve to be in this space too,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that I am. I don't need to change myself or make myself small, or change my mode of mobility to
Mm-hmm.
make not you people, but to make others feel more comfortable. Like,
Exactly.
I deserve to be as I am, who I am, in the body that I'm in.
Right. Yeah.
And that took such a long time to get to that point. But I mean, I'm glad I'm at that point. But
But the fact that you had to work so hard and to have other people really telling you that, and I'm so glad you had the other people telling you that and helping you get to that point. But there are people born every day who already know that they are allowed to exist. And it breaks my heart that there's so many people who don't realize that. And that's something, we discussed earlier. That's something that I've been trying to come to terms with, is like, hey, I'm allowed to exist. I'm
right.
allowed to take up space here. And I think it was you who posted recently. I don't know. I saw it on social media, and if it wasn't you who posted it, I definitely thought of you. But it was this post about how um, saying the woman couldn't get into the building because of her wheelchair.
Right.
It's completely the wrong way of thinking. Instead, we should say the building was not accessible for the woman, but we
Right.
always make it the fault of the person
Right.
so that we can make them feel less than, so that we can treat them as less than, instead
It,
of saying society should have done better because this person matters just as much as I do.
it's the disabled person's fault for being disabled that
Right.
they can't get into a non-accessible building.
Exactly. And that's I mean, that's exactly it. And that's how, especially people without disabilities, are kind of inherently raised, whether and I say that, obviously there's exceptions, but I would argue that the majority is raised that way, that is just, oh, well, that's kind of a them problem, instead
Right.
of saying that's an us problem. We as society needs to do better.
Yeah. And I have a similar conversation with people almost every day, because again, being on crutches, it's kind of the exception and not the norm.
Mhm.
You know, I have conversations with people saying that, I don't get an off day being disabled. Like, I'm
Mhm.
always disabled. I'm always thinking of, okay, how am I going to navigate myself into this building, or is it accessible, or is there a ramp, or does it have an elevator? Like, there's not a time that I'm not thinking of how am I being impacted by my disability in the environment that I'm in.
Which is completely backwards how it should be, because we as society should be thinking, is this environment accessible? You know,
Right.
where I work now, we just moved offices a little bit ago, but it is accessible. But where we worked before, it was technically accessible, but we never used the front door that actually had the ramp.
Mhm.
So if that didn't get shoveled in the winter, nobody cared because we didn't use that, and there was nobody who needed that.
Right.
But that is something, and thankfully I work at a place where, had that been needed, it would have been shoveled, salted, completely, clear, to make it fully accessible. But I think about that a lot, that is just not the norm.
No, it's not, and I don't know how to make it the norm, but continuing conversations like this, I think, is a start. So
do I hear a kitty in the background?
You do hear a kitty in the background. It's my wonderful new kitty that we adopted has come to join me for the podcast, and
Aww.
I think with that probably means it's time for us to wrap up. I know you've got a little one that probably has a bedtime coming up, if not.
It's the weekend. She's good.
But I did want to thank you, for taking, a better portion of an hour or so to have this discussion, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly, and hopefully we can catch up again in less than a month time.
Yes.
And continue on with more discussions and maybe come to solutions to some of these topics that we've been debating on.
Agreed. And if I can just take like maybe 2 more minutes real quick. No? Okay.
I'm kidding. I just had a moment of Josh in me. So
I figured, but I don't want to think you're joking when you're not. But I did actually, before this, I just real quickly Googled, what can be done to make voting more accessible, because I'm passionate about voting and I'm passionate about making things accessible. So I found this article. It's actually from Ben and Jerry's, one of my favorite ice cream places.
Yes.
And they have this whole article. It is from 2020. So I don't know if all of the factual information is still current. But, just a couple points they made is putting voter registration online, or just making voter registration automatic, making registration portable so it's not as challenging, or people don't have to re-register after they move, things like that. Or they don't have to travel, they don't have to go places to move if they're still within the same state. Cutting down wait times, because for the presidential election, I stood in line for the better part of an hour in order to vote. And granted, that was the presidential election, but without waiting in line, no problem for me, but it could have been a huge problem for somebody who's on crutches. Early voting, so that things aren't as crowded, so that people can schedule voting around work or family commitments, or vote early in case they get sick or they need to travel. Just those little things, making Election Day a federal holiday, so that I think about back when Josh used to work at Target, and he would have to spend up to 2 hours each way on the bus. So if you work a 9-hour shift, plus you have 4 hours of commute, are you really going to get to the polls? I don't think so.
No, ain't nobody got time for that.
Exactly. And I mean, that sounds exhausting. As a person who is fully able, just the idea of spending 2 hours on the bus, working 9 hours, and then spending 2 more hours on the bus, I'm not going to go vote after that. Heck no. So, there are some things that can be done, that should be done, just to make voting kind of that bare minimum of accessible, I think. And that's something I really hope we can keep discussing, or, start thinking about ways that we can start pushing for those, because they're important. They're necessary. Like I said, they're the bare minimum. We're not even doing that anymore.
No, we're not. And we will continue pushing for change. And anybody that wants to, offer some solutions, they can certainly, follow us on social media at the Cruising Cripples on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and email us at thecruisingcripples@gmail.com. And I'm interested to see what others have to add to this, and see what others might have in the way of solutions or alternatives, or maybe just another way of thinking about things along these lines.
Absolutely. Or even a story to say how you've been impacted by things not being accessible. I think that's really important too, to talk about your stories and to be heard. Your voice is your power.
Yeah, I think maybe as it gets closer to Election Day, maybe I'll I say maybe because the day will come and then I'll decide I don't want to do it. But maybe kind of doing just almost a day in the life of, okay, here's the process that I like, filming the process of what I need to do, and what my challenges are getting to the polls and
Mhm.
getting voted. I'm sure they won't allow cameras like inside the the voting booths and things like that. But just to kind of see what the process is like.
Absolutely.
I would be interested to see what others' experiences are. So
Even if you can't do a recording, or if that's too much effort when everything else is going on, even just kind of keeping track of times, text yourself or text somebody like, just got to the polls, just got in line, just finally got done standing in line to get, whatever the voting process is, get my ballot, had to wait in line for one of the like kind of closed off areas, again, depending on how voting is set up. What is the time frame for you, and is that truly an accessible time frame? What is the time frame for me as an able person? Was it an inconvenience? I would love to hear from people with any sort of disabilities, like, what is your voting experience and what do you think can be done to make it better?
yeah. So I'll be posing that question. I'll add that to the podcast, and people can actually go and listen to the podcast up on Spotify. This will be up, shortly, and you can go to the Spotify link and you can answer the poll question there. So we'll put that up and look forward to getting everybody's feedback. But Laura, I know it's getting late, so I don't want to keep you much longer. So I do appreciate you taking the better part of your evening to sit and discuss some of these interesting topics with me, and I look forward to the next chance we get to talk some more.
Agreed. Thank you so much. It was good chatting with you again.
You as well. I'll talk to you soon.
Have a good night.
You too.
Bye.
All right. Bye bye. All right. So I just want to thank Laura for joining me once again and remind everyone that no matter what life throws at you, keep on rolling.